Hey everyone, happy spooky season, which means one thing. We're back.
That's right, and this year we've got 2 more stories for you exploring what if the Pokemon world had a zombie apocalypse.
If you haven't seen last season, a link to the playlist will be in the iCard above, so be sure to check it out since we're picking up right where we left off.
Also, don't forget to do the usual YouTube stuff like subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with friends.
But enough of us boring you to death. Let's get on with scaring you to death.
So sit back, relax if you can, and enjoy Chapter 5, Survivor.
All in all, life's pretty great. This is the thought that passes through Tracy's head as he makes his way out into Oak's Corral to do his usual rounds. He's got a great job, great friends, and even the weather's great. Honestly, if everything could just stay like today forever, he'd be set for life. Speaking of being set, the young Pokemon watcher sets about his work, making sure all the Pokemon are okay and wheeling out a cart of Pokemon food as it's mealtime for all of Ash's Pokemon. Ever the little helper, Bulbasaur is the first to greet him, trundling up his side on its sturdy legs and getting a head pat before fulfilling its own role as the de facto leader of its trainer's Pokemon, calling them all over. One by one, Ash's reserves begin to make their way towards the food cart, coming from the fields, forest, sky, and pond, having all engaged in their own kind of fun. For some, like Infernape and Charizard, this is training, while the other ones, like Totodile and Oshawott, it's playing with friends. And for those, like Snorlax, a day like today is the perfect time to have a midday nap under the warmth of the sun. As his old friends teammates begin making their way up, Tracy greets and counts each of them, as part of his job is making sure everyone gets fed, a more challenging task than some would expect, as in the few weeks she's been here, Snivy has stubbornly refused to eat until after he's left. Probably a response to Ash being gone, since the early days of adjustment can often be hard. Another frequent problem child is Ash's Scraggy, who is just as likely to headbutt Tracy as it is to greet him with a smile. Though, thankfully, the eternally maternal Levani has been working with it to cope both with the absence of its trainer and its best buddy Axew. Unfortunately, it seems this may not be going as well as Tracy had hoped, since today neither the bug grass nor the willful lizard have turned up for their meal. Looking down at Bulbasaur, the young man questions if it knows where the pair are, and extending a vine, the seed Pokemon points in the direction of the forest, near the boundary of the property. Scooping up a bowl of Pokemon food in each hand, Tracy takes off at a bit of a jog, calling out both Scraggy and Levani, though to his dismay, he gets no response. Figuring they must be pretty deep in if they can't hear him, since surely Levani would respond at least if it could, Tracy picks up the pace, leaping over some roots and crying the pair's names at the top of his lungs. This time, he does hear something, a low melodious coo, and recognizing it as Levani's attempt at comforting, the young watcher zeroes in on it, fearing that perhaps Scraggy is hurt.
However, never in his wildest dreams could he have imagined what he would see as he bursts into a nearby clearing, as like he thought, Levani is comforting Scraggy, holding it on its lap and stroking its face. Though, when its long leafy hand moves just enough that Tracy can get a proper look at Scraggy, he is horrified to see that almost half of the shedding Pokemon's face is gone. Its skin and muscle mysteriously vanish to reveal exposed skull. Though, this is not all, as when Levani looks up at the sound of Tracy's disgusted gasp, there is something very wrong with its eyes, and so dropping the bowls, he runs back the way he came. Thanks to his training as a Pokemon watcher as well as his time as Oak's assistant, he is observant enough to conclude that this must be some new infection or parasite, and a fast-moving one at that, since just last night he helped Scraggy exfoliate off its excess dry skin and it was fine then. Maybe the professor will know, so now the best thing he can do for Scraggy and Levani is find him as soon as possible and enlist his help. However, as you will soon learn, it's not just Scraggy and Levani. As leaping into the corral, he bears witness to a sight of utter carnage, as the Pokemon he just fed are now in a state of frenzy, screaming at the top of their lungs, or else biting anyone within reach. Once again, Bulbasaur has distinguished itself as a leader, though this time not in a good way, as it leads the rampaging remnants of Ash's Pokemon against some of their larger and more powerful friends like Charizard, Sceptile, and Crocodile. While not as bad, some of the other trainers' Pokemon are also beginning to go berserk, with the most notable being Gary's Blastoise, who has those same wrong eyes as Levani, as it begins dousing its own teammates with its twin cannons. From the looks of things, this water does more than just damage, as those struck by it seem a little woozy, suggesting whatever this sickness is, it can be transmitted through fluid contact or bites. This is terrible news, as if somehow this thing has made it to the Orange Islands, everything's surrounded by water and water types are abundant. But surely, that can't have happened. His family would have called and warned him, though all the same, he really should check on them. Reaching the lab at last, Tracy runs for the phone bank, though when he punches in the number for his house with shaking fingers, he gets the answering machine, only heightening his anxiety. While a rational part of him knows they're probably just out for lunch, an irrational part of him refuses to believe it, so that when he hears Professor Oak coming up behind him, the first words out of his mouth are, "I have to go."
From the harried look on Oak's face, it is clear that he has also seen what is going on outside, and so, nodding firmly, he wishes his assistant luck, promising that he will handle things here until he gets back. Then, as the pair shake hands, Tracy takes off down the high street. While he had not intended to stop until he reached the blimp port in Viridian City, when Ash's house comes into view, he decides to make a quick detour, since he knows if the roles were reversed, his old friends would check up on his family for him. Leaping the fence in the testament to the adrenaline pumping through him, Tracy cries out for Miss Ketchum to see if she's alright. Like in the forest, he gets no answer, though this time he is not left wondering why for long, as when he steps inside, he bears witness to a scene from a nightmare. The living room bathed floor to ceiling in fresh blood, while at the center of it stands Mimey, its psychic aura slowly fading, and its eyes like those he saw at the lab. Bolting upright, Tracy has to suppress a scream. Thankfully, he had a year to master this skill, as every night since that dreadful dream, his dreams have always taken him back there to relive it, but be helpless to change the outcome. His own private hell, though not too far removed from the hell that is his waking world, when even a poorly timed scream can be a death sentence. Wiping the sweat off of his brow, Tracy looks around the clearing for his canteen as his throat is painfully dry, and spotting it resting on one of the nearby tree stumps, he reaches for it. Even now, after all this time, he instinctively does so with his right hand, a futile effort, and a painful one too, as he is reminded for the umpteenth time of all that he has lost since coming here, as he stares at his maimed and bandaged hand, where now resides the stumps of his thumb, index, and middle fingers. It had happened not long after reaching the Orange Archipelago, since while he intended to take the blimp directly to Tangelo Island, that, like everything else, had not gone to plan, forcing him to barter his way aboard a fishing trawler that could take him as far as Rand Island. Remembering this place from when he, Ash, and Misty followed Dr. Quackenpoker here, Tracy had known that it was only a few islands from his home, so with a bit of hard work and some luck, he could still make it to his destination before long. How naive he had been, as before he had even made it 10 paces from the beach, he come across more infected, driving him inland as they displayed some primal version of pack tactics, or maybe just swarm tactics. In response, he had called for Scyther, Merrill, and Venonat to fight for him, and together they had shown the might of their teamwork, driving the menaces off and allowing Tracy to rest. Having grown hungry from the chase, he had reached up into a nearby pechaberry tree to grab a snack for himself and his friends, though this had shown just how foolish he was back then, as just because the obvious horde of sick had been driven away didn't mean the area was safe, a fact he would learn as a moment later an infected ladybug had bitten down on his fingers. At the sound of Tracy's pained cry, his Pokémon had sprung into action, with Scyther as the largest and only flyer reaching him first, or more accurately, reaching Ladybug, as when the deceased bug had attempted to flee, Scyther had cut it down with a single fluid motion. Perhaps it was thanks to the experience gained from this fight and the battle with the Horde, or else because the island had remained relatively the same as it had centuries ago, but no sooner has Ladybug fallen than Scyther began to glow with evolutionary light. However, when it changed, it was not into the conventional Scizor, but into a brown, bulkier bug that Tracy had only ever heard about in stories, Cleavor.
Looking down at its trainer with a furrow to its much heavier brow, Clevo had barked something that sounded like concern, with it taking this to remind Tracy in the heat of his excitement that he had been injured. Now aware of his situation once more, Tracy had felt his bites burning as something had tried to make its way into his bloodstream. And knowing he didn't have much time, he had turned to Clevo and asked for its help with the only surefire way to prevent this infection: amputation. As they had been in a clearing, it did not take Tracy and his Pokemon long to find a flat surface, in this case, a rock. As the Pokemon Watcher had laid his hand upon it, Clevo raised its own axe arm high. Due to the position of the bites, and the fact he needed some skin to fold over to prevent further more mundane infections, this cut had needed to be at a diagonal angle that would also cost him his middle finger, though in light of what he stood to lose if this failed, he reluctantly told Clevo to do it. Mercifully, the procedure had been short, though it was far from painless, as the last thing Tracy remembers before passing out is the sound of his own screams. Back in the present, Tracy turns his gaze away from his maimed hand and over to Cleavor, who lays sleeping against another stump. To this day, a part of him wonders if its archaic evolution is indicative of the world becoming more brutal and less civilized, a change she knows applies to himself as much as anyone, since they had all needed to adapt in order to survive in the new world they had found themselves in. It had taken roughly a month to reach Tangelo Island, though in that time, Tracy had learned more than he ever imagined possible, namely how to use his Pokemon's natural abilities to his advantage, specifically Venonat's radar eyes and Maryl's super-sensitive hearing. By combining those skills, he had found himself with the ideal method of scanning for danger, not to mention his own training as a Pokemon watcher, since all those years of practice had allowed him to remain ever vigilant about his surroundings, as well as remain still for extended periods, making him harder for the adult infected to notice, though not impossible, with there being more than a few run-ins which invariably ended in battles until he and his team could flee. However, after all his struggle, Tracy did at last lay eyes upon his home, having used Meryl as a makeshift boogie board to stay afloat as he swam between islands, with the Aquamouse even being kind enough to pull him while he slept, so he could avoid staying in one place for too long, for fear of infected water types. Returning the little blue Pokemon with his thanks as it deserved a rest after what they'd just been through, he had brought out Venonat in its place, and after receiving the all-clear from the poison bug, had begun making his way down the deserted streets towards his house. Each step had brought with it a new sight of desolation and horror, as the houses all shared the characteristic signs of having been ransacked, and when he reached his own home, the results were no different, with it being obvious that his family had attempted to erect a barricade from the boarded-up windows, and that it had failed from the fragments of furniture lying across the broken-down doorway.
Having no desire to see a repeat of what he saw in Ash's house, Tracy had turned to leave, no destination in his mind beyond not here, though this had been brought to a screeching halt when Venonat had tugged at his leg and gestured with its antennae to signify that there was movement nearby. Crouching low, the dark-haired young man had brought out Meryl next, asking if the movements were the infected, and having become familiar enough with their listless gait and other telltale signs, Meryl had been able to identify that yes, they were present, but there was also someone else there, a fact it conveyed through both a nod and a shake. Figuring this had to be a survivor, Tracy deftly followed his two teammates, with them quickly directing him to a treehouse in his neighbor's yard. Evidently, the inhabitants had figured by climbing inside and pulling up the ladder after them, they'd be safe, though instead, all they had managed to do was trap themselves inside with half a dozen of the infected scratching at the base of the tree. Considering a few of these were Pokemon with the capability to fell a tree no problem, both Tracy and those trapped inside had known it was only a matter of time before the treehouse came tumbling down, assuming nothing interfered. And that is precisely what Tracy had done, bringing out Cleavor and having all three of his Pokemon deftly dispatch the sick while he pointed out the weak points on Pokemon and humans alike, having become something of an expert in anatomy under Professor Oak. Finally, when the infected had all been dispatched, as they lacked even the basic survival instinct to halt their attack and flee to save themselves, the people inside the treehouse had poked their heads out, calling for their thanks. Surprisingly, Tracy had recognized the pair, Sissy and her brother Senta. Recognizing him too, and remembering the crush he had had once on her, Sissy had invited the Pokemon Watcher to come up and join them. Though having long since abandoned such thoughts as romance, Tracy had instead told them to simply throw their food down and he'd be on his way. As he said this, all three of his Pokemon had taken up more combative stances, causing Sissy to gasp as she can't believe he'd robbed them. Factually, Tracy replied that he could have just left the infected to take them out since they wouldn't have cared about the packaged food, so he could have taken all of it, but he just wants half, so hand it over. For a moment, Sissy and Senta had conferred in whispers, and while Tracy had not been able to hear them, he had known what they were going to say. Sissy's Pokemon had surely already been lost, or she would have used them to fight off that horde, so a fight would end badly for them, or at least this way they could keep half their food for themselves. Finally, after letting out a deep sigh, the siblings had then dropped several packages of chips and dried fruit, all the while glaring at their savior. Once, this would have made Tracy feel bad, but that had been in the old world. In the new world, questions of morality were one of the first luxuries a person needed to surrender if they wished to survive.
Gathering up his ill-gotten gains and storing them in his waterproof bag alongside Cleavor and Venonat's balls, Tracy had departed, not even sparing a word of parting for Sissy and Senta. Only Meryl had stayed out, as he needed to serve as his boogie board again. Though, just because they could go to other places didn't mean they had anywhere to go, as with the inhabited islands either shut down or destroyed, and now hotspots for ravenous undead, Tracy had stuck to the mostly uninhabited islands. islands. However, even those had some danger to contend with, though having become a well-oiled machine by now, Marrow, Cleaver, and Venonat had handled it, though perhaps a little too well, as following a battle with a horde, Venonat had followed in Cleaver's footsteps and evolved. While this had come at the cost of its radar eyes, Tracy had been far from upset, as now they had an aerial scout, meaning he could search for enemies or resources and they'd be set. Things had truly seemed to be looking up for the black-haired boy, and so smiling for the first time in weeks, he had instructed his scout to search for a good spot to camp then come back. Chittering eagerly, the poison bug took flight, its eyes already scanning for good locations as it vanished into the horizon, a horizon from which it never returned. This painful memory forces Tracy out of his reverie, and it is for the best, as he still has much to do before today's plan can come to fruition, namely boiling water to restock the canteen, since considering all the infected still dwelling in the sea, he wouldn't drink unboiled water even if the salt wouldn't drive him mad. Though, perhaps he is already mad, at least a little. What man wouldn't be after enduring all of this? As if to remind him of all he'd lost and suffered, the fin of an all too familiar Sharpedo then burst from the water circling the bay. This beast had been his jailer for the last several months, as while crossing islands with Marrow as per usual, it had struck. To this day, Tracy does not know what drew Sharpedo to them. Maybe it was his kicking, the smell of Marrow in the water, or something else entirely. All he knows is that it struck without warning, goring his little water type with its fin, then going on a feeding frenzy when Marrow's blood had begun flowing into the water. Thankfully by now Tracy had mastered his policy of not screaming, as otherwise surely this monster would have eaten him too. And so though it broke his heart to lose one of his oldest companions, he had paddled his way to shore, knowing he could do nothing for Marrow.
In doing so, however, he had found himself trapped, as even his strong swimmer could not carry him to another island, nor could Cleavor, as his last Pokemon left. This had only left one solution, a raft. Fortunately, this island had been lush with trees for the Axe Pokemon to cut down, though less fortunately, the Pokemon who lived in them had not taken too kindly to this deforestation. While not infected like everywhere else they had been, these Pokemon had been giant, revealing that they must have landed on Fairchild Island, though knowing his location had been little comfort for him and Cleavor, as they had split their time between surviving and acquiring resources for their raft. At first, Tracy had more or less been unable to help with the chopping, though that had been before he had acquired an axe, courtesy of none other than his Venomoth. As instructed, it had sought out its retrainer to return to him, though in that time it had become markedly different from what it was before, as now it carried the taint of the plague right onto the island, its addled brain only capable of the final instruction it had received, though like Venomoth itself, this instruction had been twisted by the infection, as upon seeing Tracy, it lunged for his jugular with poisonous fangs, intent on feeding on the one it had been so driven to seek. Having recognized what Venomoth had become, Cleavor had leapt into action, placing itself between the poison moth and its trainer with the feral flyer's fangs, finding perches in its rocky arm instead. Worriedly, Tracy had cried out for both Cleavor and Venomoth, afraid to lose them both so soon after Marrow, though doing what it's named for, Cleavor had cleaved, bringing its free axe hand down through its own arm to split the moth in half. Then, as the fragments hit the ground, so did Cleavor, overcome with pain, while Tracy rushed to its side and began applying an herbal ointment he had made which could combat the mundane infection. Thankfully, due to cutting quickly and lower than the bite, those were the only infections Cleavor had to worry about, and after cleaning out the arm, Tracy had been able to set to work.
Truthfully, this did not make things much quicker, as he had only been using that which his rock-bug friend had lost, though it had allowed them to get more done, as now they were working with the strength and resolve of two. Day in and day out, the pair of brothers, for that is truly what they were by now, pushed on tirelessly, chopping down trees, carving them into shape, and assembling by the shore to serve as the foundation of their raft. It had been slow, laborious work, but finally, after months of hardship, they had finished their raft last night, and knowing it was too dangerous to set off in the dark, they had stretched out under the stars for their final night on Fairchild Island. And so, with the day now at hand and his preparations complete, Tracy is ready to set off, though first he must wake his partner. Returning to their campsite, he calls for Cleavor to get up since it slept in long enough. Then, when it does not respond, he bends over and shakes it, only to find it cold. Though consciously he knows what this means, whatever part of Tracy still feels after all he's lost reaches out, checking for a pulse or a hint of breath, but as he thought, both turn up nothing, leaving behind the irrefutable fact that Cleavor is gone. Were he still capable of tears, he might have wept for the unfairness of it. The time would catch up with the old bug today of all days, after all its sacrifice they could get off the island, so he could get off the island. In that moment, Tracy knows without being told that this is the truth. Cleavor's time had come long ago, but it held on just long enough to fulfill its duty to its brother. Then, once this was done, it had allowed itself to lay its weapons and armor down. Seeing no reason to stick around now, Tracy does not linger, gathering up his food and freshly boiled water and boarding his raft, which he kicks off to sea. Looking down at the ocean, which shows no sign of Sharpedo, and then back at the island, he thinks of Cleavor. Its final wish had been for him to be free. But that's the problem. No one can be free in a world as hellish as theirs has become. Then he hears it. Cleavor's cry echoing out from the forest, serving as an unwelcome reminder that even death cannot offer freedom anymore.
And this is where we'll be leaving things for now, though we have many more stories to tell set in this zombie, ravaged Pokemon world.
The next of which will be on my channel, premiering at 9 AM AST on Friday, which is 5 PM PST on Thursday, so be sure to check it out.
And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to me and Pickle Dill.
But until then, we'll catch you when the journey continues. And remember, beware what goes bump in the night.